And we are recording. So greetings and welcome everyone to our session titled In This Moment, Social Determinants, Human Trafficking and Health Implications with Dr. Celia McIntosh. Today's session is part of Geneseo's month-long celebration honoring Black History Month, as well as our 4th annual day-long diversity summit. As part of our efforts of becoming an anti-racist college, this series of events and sessions planned and organized by the Anti-Racism and DEI Subcommittee of the President's Commission on Diversity and Community will hopefully spark discussions, reflections, and actions as we work towards this vision of anti-racism. I am putting a link here in the chat of the other presentations that are part of this series. And before we begin, I ask that everybody mute your microphones during the presentation. We do encourage you to use the chat feature to provide questions for the presenter, and I will continue to monitor the chat. We've allowed time at the end for a Q&A. We just ask that all questions and comments be grounded in respect, with no disrespect towards the presenter, moderator, or other participants. Dr. Celia McIntosh, who is presenting today, received a Doctor of Nursing Practice from St. John Fisher College and is duly certified family and psychiatric nurse practitioner. As an anti-traffic advocate, Dr. McIntosh serves as president of the Rochester Regional Coalition Against Human Trafficking. And with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Celia McIntosh. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. So I'm going to share my slides, everyone, and then I'm going to go off camera, okay?
So I have to send a picture to Margaret.
Okay, can you see my slides okay?
Yes, Dr. McIntosh, we can definitely see your slides.
Okay, thank you. So the focus of my talk today is to really talk a little bit about social determinants of health, human trafficking. I will infuse some discussion about race because, you know, you just had your diversity talk and some of the intersectionality about that and some of the health consequences that trafficking victims often suffer. I don't have any disclosures. The overarching objectives here are really to kind of, like I said, discuss the intersection of social determinants of health, human trafficking, the health consequences, talk a little bit about the health ramifications of human trafficking, and some of the key determinants that facilitate or makes individuals vulnerable for trafficking. So just to talk a little bit about myself. So, you know, a lot of people want to know like how, so just to give you a little bit of background, I have been a nurse practitioner since 2012, family nurse practitioner, and I work in neurology, inpatient neurology. I see patients with strokes and seizures, MS, or just dementia. You know, sometimes they call us for toe pain, but that's just besides the point. But working in that field, you know, a lot of people say, well, how did you get involved, you know, in advocating or being an anti-trafficking advocate? And so just to give you the backstory on that, in 2013, I had wanted to take advantage of my passion for, you know, nursing and law. And I decided that I wanted to do sexual assault kits. And after doing that for about a year, I just decided that I didn't want to do it anymore. I had a patient that came in, you know, for a sexual assault kit after she had been raped. And there were 5 of us in the room with her. And I just remember, you know, standing there, you know, just thinking about how she must have felt with all these people in the room having to retell her story multiple times. So I just felt like I was getting a little of the vicarious secondary trauma. So I happened to be walking into work in April of 2014, And that's when I met the coalition. There was an organization there that was having a conference. They had been a part of this by having a table event, and they were bringing awareness to human trafficking. When I walked up to the table and they told me about human trafficking for the first time, I was blown away. I never heard of this. I had been to 3 different schools of nursing. I had no context about human trafficking. I didn't know someone could be, as a human being, really be so vile and commit such a heinous crime towards individuals. And that's essentially when I got involved. I could not unhear the information. So I started going to meetings and I just started doing my own research. And what I found out at the time was that same year, a landmark study came out stating that 88% of victims come in contact with healthcare providers. But the gag was, we didn't know what to look for. We didn't know what red flags were. We never heard of the concept of human trafficking. So that's when I went on the quest to educate other healthcare providers about this issue. And that, like I said, led me to be more involved in the coalition. In 2016, I became the president. Under my leadership thus far, we've done a lot of initiatives. We talked to police officers, we've talked to churches, we've talked to, we've gone into some hotels trying to, educate them about this information. But for the most part, anyone who's willing to listen, we've talked to, and definitely impacted over, I'm sure we've done at least over 5,000 talks since we've been in existence to different individuals in the community. And we've also launched a Yes Here campaign back in 2016, where we put our message on RTS buses, monitors, inside cars, just to bring awareness that yes, human trafficking is here in Rochester. So fast forwarding, that's essentially how I got here. Okay. So just to give you a brief overview, because I know that everyone probably has some varying experience in terms of their knowledge of human trafficking, just to set the stage. We know that slavery is a part of the fabric of the history and has never disappeared. Instead, it's really taken on a different form, which is human trafficking. A common misconception is that trafficking is a foreign epidemic. Oftentimes we hear people, even in 2020, say, oh, that's in Africa, right? That's in Asia. That doesn't happen here. But what we know is that trafficking is a symptom of a larger social issue. Social isms such as classism, sexism, racism, all contribute to human trafficking, and they're pretty much foundational to the abuse. And in order to address the symptoms, you can't simply just put a Band-Aid on it. We have to figure out what the root cause of it is. Trafficking occurs in all 50 states. We know that the victims of trafficking share one essential experience, and that's that they have loss of freedom. Victims can be trafficked in their own communities, in their own home. Trafficking does not have to involve movement. Human trafficking has also been said to be the fastest growing criminal industry in the world, second largest to organized crime. So, I'll put that in context. It's a $150 billion industry. Oftentimes people reflects to doing human trafficking because drugs can only be sold once, where human beings can be sold anywhere from 10 to 50 times a night. And the price varies. So it's a lucrative business with low penalties because the laws are just essentially catching up. Human trafficking did not essentially become a federal crime until 2000 with the passage of the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, which is the TVPA. So if you think about it, it's only been 22 years in existence. We know that the prevalence of human trafficking often is very difficult to obtain because of the illegal nature of the crime. So a lot of the questions we get is, how many people are trafficked in Rochester? How many people are trafficked, period, in the world? So we can give some ranges, but I'm sure that there's no accuracy in them. We just have a baseline. But people are not walking up to individuals saying, hey, I'm a victim of trafficking. And the reality of it is oftentimes they don't know they're trafficking. They don't understand that language. It doesn't resonate with them. So oftentimes they have to be educated to understand what that wording and that terminology is. Traffickers are notorious on grooming and developing relationships. They prey on your vulnerability with their victims. And the whole the whole point of this is to deceive these individuals and turn a profit. So it's all about power, control, and revenue. 50% of traffickers have been women, which oftentimes have been trafficked themselves. And that's information that people often don't know. So I'm going to use this, speak about this in the context of Rochester. So somewhere in the area, we know that a woman or man is selling herself on Lyle Avenue and knows no one will provide her food, shelter, or drugs she's addicted to if she doesn't earn the money this way. Someone is working in a restaurant from before it opens until after it closes every day. They believe that they're being paid, they're paying off a debt, but every day it grows and it's not shrinking. A teenager may be in the suburbs and could be sold online through an online classified site by a pimp. A child in elementary school could be forced to engage in sexual acts, which are filmed and sold online, which, like I said, is very detrimental to them. So when we think about human trafficking, the definition is very straightforward in a sense. Human trafficking, it's a crime involving exploitation of someone for the purpose of compelled labor or commercial sex act through force, fraud, or coercion. So let's pull that apart. So when we talk about coercion, that could be psychological coercion. Oh, like if you love me, you would do this for me. Or it could be chemical coercion where someone hooks someone on drugs and then the drug now becomes the pimp or the trafficker. Fraud, someone essentially taking your documents, they'll trick you and say, hey, we have a job here in the United States. It's paying X amount of dollars. You'll get to see your family. This is what you need to do. You can really help your family if you do this. And they get here and it's kind of a bait and switch. They take their ID. They pay them minimum, not even minimum wage, maybe $1 an hour. And they work them long hours. And oftentimes they're in poor substandard conditions, housing, and poor substandard food as well. And then of course, force can be anything, beatings, punching, slashing them, cutting them with a razor. Just a lot of torture is affiliated with that. The difference though with this is that when we're talking about a younger person that's under 18 years of age, that is forced to do a commercial sex act, they do not have to prove force, fraud, or coercion. If you're under 18 years of age, you're by definition a victim of trafficking. So sometimes we hear people say, oh, well, this 17-year-old girl was selling sex for, a room or for food or staying the night on someone's couch. Well, it was survival sex. They are underage. They oftentimes don't have the means. If they had another alternative, would they have made the same decision? So in that case, because they are a minor, they don't have to prove force, fraud, or coercion, but the adults have to. So just a little overview of how these elements work. There has to be action, means, and purpose. So we talked about, how is this person acquired? They're recruited. That could be through social media, technology, anything like that, by friends, families, their parents. Oftentimes we've heard people say, my mother was my first trafficker. She sold me for, to pay the rent or different things like that. And there was multiple men coming in. So that is one way. The other means that we talked about, force, fraud, or coercion. And then it's either for a commercial sex act or forced labor. So that could be, someone being forced to work as a nanny, working in fields, some kind of domestic servitude type of work, okay? So it can range. There's essentially two forms of trafficking: sex trafficking, labor trafficking. At the end of the day, sex trafficking accounts for the most. It accounts for about 73% of trafficking. Oftentimes it's because, like I said, it's very lucrative in terms of, there's a high demand for those type of sexual services. So in a global landscape, what does this look like? We know that over 40 million victims are worldwide. We know that human trafficking affects every country, and I would say all 50 states of the United States. Anyone can be a victim, but we know that oftentimes the ones that are most vulnerable are the more marginalized individuals. Women and girls account for about 71% of the victimization overall. So where does New York State fare? New York State, and this is actually, I believe, a graph from 2019, but even in the recent one, New York State still has the fourth highest call volume. When I started researching human trafficking back in 2014, up until about 2016, I believe, New York State was the fifth. Over the last couple of years consecutively, we've gone up to the fourth, highest. We've had the fourth highest call volume to this national human trafficking hotline. So a part of me says, well, why is that happening? Is it happening because there's more awareness around the issue of human trafficking? Or is it because there's actually new cases? So there seems to be a little gap in the knowledge of, what exactly it is. But the fact that we are the fourth says that there's something going on. So when we think about Polaris Project, it's essentially the national human trafficking organization, and they house the hotline. So a lot of the calls get filtered through them, and they do the research and they produce these statistics. And what they found was that the top recruiting tactics for individuals, specifically for sex trafficking, is often an overlap of intimate partner violence. Human trafficking is hugely relationship based. So, and a lot of people kind of think about, well, why does that happen? We also know that there's a huge intersection between domestic violence and trafficking. The parallels of domestic violence include there's exposure to various forms of abuse. There's abuse often leads to health problems, mental, physical, acute, and chronic. There's reluctance for individuals to disclose their situation. There's a lot of fear and shame, guilt, feelings of low self-esteem with this relationship. And there's a lot of conflict around leaving the situation. And when we talk about human trafficking, we're talking about trauma bonding, Stockholm syndrome, the fact that this person could have allowed me to die, but they didn't. So you feel like you have to have some kind of obligation to stay with them. So there's that conflict of leaving the situation. And then, of course, there's the vulnerability of being re-victimized. Oftentimes, there's a lack of physical abuse with these individuals too, because traffickers want the most bang for their buck. So they want their product, individuals are treated like commodities. So they want their product essentially to have the best look, to be marketable. So oftentimes they try to steer away from physical abuse, but there are other methods of abuse. You can see here by the star one, it says isolation, emotional abuse, economical abuse, and basically threats, and then physical really being the last. So even with, I talked a little bit about labor trafficking earlier, and having that false job offer is number one. When we talk about other risk factors of human trafficking, when we talk about recent migration, relocation, we're still in the midst of a pandemic. Even in situations like hurricanes, pandemics, they create a lot of chaos. A lot of people lost their jobs, a lot of people lost their housing. So they have to move. They become more vulnerable. So many of those things are risk factors. And of course, substance abuse, runaways and homeless youth. And we know that Center for Youth, they have had children that have acknowledged that they have been sold for sex. So what's the cost? Human trafficking takes an immense toll on the quality of human life as well as society. There's a big public health issue when we talk about communicable diseases like tuberculosis, sexually transmitted diseases, other skin infestations. But the other things too are that oftentimes just because someone is being trafficked, that does not mean that they're not going to have other medical illnesses that like high blood pressure, like diabetes, like asthma or dental problems. So why is it such a big problem? You know, many of the reasons are because sexual trafficking, or just trafficking in general, occurs to low risk, and because there's high yield and profit. Oftentimes there's been a lack of government and law enforcement training. There's low community awareness, people thinking it doesn't happen in our backyard, it's over there in Asia. Ineffective or unused laws, lack of law enforcement investigation, scarce resources of victim recovery, and society blaming victims. They think, it's your fault why you're in the situation, which doesn't help the issue. As long as there is high demand, there will always be supply. In the absence of law, violence will always trump human rights. So other types of sex trafficking, one of the big ones that I didn't think about when I started doing these talks, forced marriages. They account for about, I believe, 14 million of individuals that are trafficked. And then, of course, pimp-controlled trafficking. We talked a little bit about survivor sex, and then, of course, gang trafficking too. And that may also include being forced to sell drugs as well. So why do people even get into this problem anyway? There's a lot of different social determinants of health and conditions that affect where people are born, where they grow, where they live, and they age. And these collective systems of injustice essentially perpetuate against a certain part of the community that are more vulnerable. So when we talk about, substance abuse, homelessness, poverty, when you even think about Rochester, it was said to be the 5th poorest city out of 75 metropolitan cities its size. And then when you think about children with single parent homes, or pretty much single mom homes, it was #1 in child poverty. So many of those situations are going to make individuals more at risk. So when we talk about poverty, it limits access to healthy foods, limit your ability to afford safer neighborhoods. It restricts healthy living conditions, promote, you have issues with transportation, there's food insecurities, living conditions are an issue. So there's just multiple factors. And then, of course, mental illness, if you're undocumented, many of these things are happening upstream that cause individuals to be more vulnerable to trafficking. So I just have a question for you guys, and if you can use the chat. I'm not going to be able to see the chat. So David, if you can pay attention to that and kind of read out some of the answers. But it's here saying, does race and ethnicity contribute to the likelihood of people becoming victims of trafficking? What are your thoughts on this issue?
First thought was a yes.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. So I'm just going to move to the next slide. And if people want to say how, that's fine too in the chat. So when we talk about race and human trafficking, 40% of victims are African American. Now that's kind of strange because it's almost 4 times higher than the percentage of African Americans living in the United States. The literature suggests that the population itself for African Americans is 13%, but victims are at a 40%. So let that sink in for a minute. Why is that? Black children make up 55% of all prostitution-related arrests in the United States. So, that in itself is like, wait a minute, why is this happening? Other reasons, some contributing factors here, like I said, African-American women and girls are at higher risk. White women and girls make up about 26% of individuals that are trafficked. There's the whole contributing factor of economic disparity leads to racial disparities in this. If you can't buy food for your family, if your basic needs are not met, you're going to be at more risk. Trafficking Black women versus white women yield less jail time. This has been some things that have floated around the literature that says we know that white women may be more lucrative, but trafficking Black women may give us less jail time if we are caught. So that's one of the narratives that perpetuates this increase in race, in African Americans being trafficked. Hypersexualized stereotypes. There's been stereotypes for way back when we talked about, before, modern day slavery, there was slavery, and there was a lot of stereotypes talking about hypersexualized, Black women being more sexually promiscuous. That increases this whole narrative, and this increases the risk for them to be vulnerable, drives the narrative. Oftentimes media doesn't help. When there's minority women, lost, there's not that much coverage on them. So that basically tells the world that the media doesn't really care. They don't, they're not a priority to the community. Therefore, they can just be discarded. So other points of it is they're very much objectified in different things like music videos, mainstream media, rap music, and the whole pimp culture is glorified. In addition to that, there's also this inequity in resources. So you say, okay, well, I want to get out, but there's still limitations in the resources that you have. I met a woman that very highly educated, was a teacher over, a Black woman, teacher in China. She met someone there, started dating them. Little did she know he was using webcams to record them doing their sexual things, and then uploaded them to the website, I believe Pornhub. So now here she is in another country trying to figure this whole thing out. She comes back to the States. She actually started living here in a shelter. She got the New York State documentation that said she was a victim of trafficking. But then when she went to organizations trying to get some resources and trying to get some housing, they basically said, well, you don't meet the typical traditional definition of trafficking. So they wouldn't give her any resources. So, so like I said, just the inequity in the resources does not help you get out. So other social determinants of health, when we talk about, individuals aging out of the foster care system, you have lack of support. We talked about recent migration, trauma, isolation, if you have language barriers, if you're living in poverty, if you have a history of child abuse is the #1 predictor of human trafficking. If you have any history of neglect or malnutrition, if you identify in the LGBTQIA community, you're at higher risk. If you have been involved in the juvenile justice system or criminal justice system, you're at higher risk. Creates a lot of stigma and discrimination. And when we talk about human trafficking being hugely relationship-based, if there's a lot of family conflict, disruption or dysfunction in the family, there's maybe a lack of supportive adults, maybe there's peer pressure, maybe there's some social isolation. And oftentimes, individuals that are trafficked, they also tend to recruit their friends. Other things, maybe, community violence, undersourced schools and neighborhoods. One of the biggest, drivers, if you don't have the education, then you're not going to be able to get the jobs and the positions that you want, which further leads to an economical downpour. So we know that the pandemic, human trafficking, it's a vicious cycle. Like I said, we talked about, all these things. Human trafficking is a much bigger problem than just traffickers. It's caused by these social determinants of health, these issues of trauma, these issues of poverty, discrimination, mental illness, lack of opportunity, addiction. Oftentimes traffickers use these drugs to hook their victims on it. And some of the things that I've heard is that, when the whole thing about Narcan came out, that these traffickers would even say, well, jingle the Narcan over them and say, I'll take away that high if you don't do what I'm telling you to do. So it's just very heinous things they would do to these individuals. And then, of course, discrimination, this systematic racism is being made obvious more so now. One of the presenters, one of the previous trafficked survivors, she equated the system, the larger system, as the pimp. That they create these issues, that they don't offer equity, that they don't have these similar resources for people, and they essentially are the drivers to why people are being more vulnerable. So what do the traffickers look like? This Stephen Jones in 2018, he would sexually traffic and abuse women for his own financial gain. He would take them, from Buffalo to Albany. He would beat them. He had over 30 women working for him. He was targeting youth at East High School. There was a big article write-up in the paper, the DNC, about this. He was said to be the worst trafficker the Rochester region had seen. This one here, 2019, Andre Barnes, he would also seek out vulnerable women for prostitution visiting at social services and homeless shelters. So the very place that people are going for these services to help them get out of this life, he's there, he's targeting them. So when we think about how sex trafficking, they lure their victims, there's this concept of, I see a lot of psychology majors in here. There's this concept of the Maslow's hierarchy. And the fact that if you're at that bottom level and if your needs are not met, those basic needs are not met, that you can't get to self-actualization and feeling like you can accomplish your goals or even have a good sense of self about you. And this is what these traffickers focus on. Like he stated here, my job is to make sure she has what she needs. Personal hygiene, those basic things, get her nails done, take her to buy an outfit, take her out to eat food, basic needs, and make her feel wanted, make her feel like she belongs, but keep the money. So because he's able to fill the void, of what she needs, he's able to manipulate her and traffic her. These are some other traffickers. I won't take the time to go over them, but these are some other ones. And the three ladies at the bottom, they were at a massage parlor out in Gates. So who are the buyers? Essentially the buyers, they're not lonely, they're often married. The fact is, a buyer can be anyone and come from any race. The literature suggests that it's disproportionately white upper class men. They come from professional backgrounds, like they're police officers, they're medical doctors. They come from the educational space, tech space, maybe teachers. 54% of them are often married. And then men who purchase sex were far more likely than men who had not purchased sex to use pornography on a regular basis. So these are just some of the characteristics of these buyers. So the impact on the trafficking victims, I would say that one person is trafficked every 30 seconds. So I'm going to put it in context here. Someone has a stroke in the United States every 40 seconds. Someone has a heart disease strikes someone every 43 seconds. Someone dies of heart disease every 90 seconds. So people are actually being trafficked at a higher rate than people are having life-threatening medical illnesses, but people don't know because they're not coming in clutching their chest necessarily. They're not coming necessarily with a heart attack or a stroke. It's oftentimes psychological trauma. Now, so let me just clarify that they can come in with many of these other illnesses, falls, injuries, bruises, chest pain, but oftentimes, it's more of the psychological issue that makes them not be recognizable. And the fact that they're not coming in saying, hey, I'm a victim of trafficking. And this was, like I said, the landmark study that I talked about. 88% of victims, 63% of them come in contact with the ER. And then from there, like a Planned Parenthood, because many of these individuals, they become pregnant. So they have abortions or they become pregnant by their trafficker, which is also recruitment. It's a tactic to keep them constantly doing what they want them to do. This is not necessarily that relevant to many of what you're going to do since we just talked about the other one. So I'm just going to move forward. Some of the red flags, because people often say, well, how do I even recognize this? In the healthcare space, oftentimes it's this inconsistent history. Like you have this person coming in and they're telling you one story, but there's a lot of holes in their story. It doesn't make any sense. Or they're avoiding eye contact. Maybe they came in with someone else that's talking for them. Maybe they've, just going through their history have had multiple sexual partners. They may complain of not being paid their wages. They have not have good follow-up and care, because oftentimes these victims can be trafficked from state to state. So there's a lot of delays in care. Are they dressed appropriately for the season? So many of those things are oftentimes indicators. When we talk a little bit to healthcare providers, doing some research, these survivors said, these are the questions that were most helpful for me to be recognized. And it was simple things like, is someone holding your passport or ID? Have you been forced to have sex for money, food, shelter, or other items? Because like I said, we're talking about those basic needs. Are you in the presence of someone that intimidates you? Some of these other physical consequences that I talked about, oftentimes they may or may not have poor hygiene. Many of these individuals are going to be going to the hair salon, getting their nails done. I even had one person tell me that they ended up having a breast implant because that made them more marketable, because that's what their trafficker wanted. So oftentimes they're going to, like I said, make them more marketable so that they are able to turn a profit. But these are many of the physical consequences that they suffer. Chronic back pain, visual issues. If you're talking about someone that's being labor trafficked, maybe they're working out in the agricultural space or doing construction or manufacturing. They have exposure to respiratory things, skin issues. If you, like even in this pandemic, if you had 10 people working in the same space, not having adequate PPE, then they're all exposed to COVID. So you're working in these substandard kind of environments. Reproductive, you get a lot of individuals, like as we talked about, with pregnancy, urinary tract infections, sexually transmitted disease, forced abortions, the list goes on and on. And then, of course, a lot of psychological consequences. We have patients coming in with somatic complaints. Maybe it's really just anxiety or depression, but they're coming in saying, my belly hurts, my head hurts. And those symptoms are manifesting in a physical way, but it's really not the physical issue. It's really the emotion that's driving the physical symptom. Developing a feeling of helplessness, the shame. There's a high amount of shame that goes along with being trafficked. Oftentimes victims feel like they're the ones that got themselves into this. How did I allow myself to do this? I should have made better decisions. So there's a lot of self-hatred that happens with that. We talked a little bit about this trauma bonding. Another thing that's very classic with individuals that are trafficked are these dissociative behaviors where you just kind of have essentially this out-of-body experience. You have difficulty forming relationships because everyone that says, trust them, they love you along the way has deceived you. And of course, there's a lot of addiction issues along the way, because oftentimes these individuals, they use these substances to cope with the emotional pain to escape, or if they're being forced to have sex with 10 to 50 people a night, they use the drugs also to dissociate. So other effects of trauma, oftentimes you may, individuals say, well, why? They told me one story and now their story is changing. What's going on? I don't believe them. It's not a matter of their changing their story. It's about, let me pause here because I should have said if there was anyone that felt like they were triggered or were having any, needed to take a break or step away, you can at any time. I should have said that in the beginning. But if you feel like you need to do so, definitely do that at any point. But some of the effects of the trauma is that their memory is impaired. They can't concentrate. Learning is difficult for them to focus. So as healthcare providers, if we're sticking papers in front of them and saying, fill these papers out, or they're going to some of these social services places and we're saying, hey, you need to fill out this 20 packet of paper for you to get housing or for you to get resources, that's going to be difficult for them. So we're doing a disservice to them. Other things that it really impairs your ability to trust and cope and of course have healthy relationships. How do you move past this trafficked episode? We had a speaker at our conference that we put on that said she initially kind of signed on to the idea because the way that they presented it to her, and then she ended up being in the life for 7 years. So trauma really shapes, your belief about yourself, and then your ability to, your outlook on life and your ability to hope. You feel very hopeless. And just some things I have researched, oftentimes people say, well, why do they stay? They're not handcuffed. Why don't they just run? Oftentimes the psychological, the bondage is in the mind, what this trafficker has said. And some people, because of the way they're groomed or introduced to the life, oftentimes, it's this person that have met them and it's like a boyfriend, girlfriend relationship. And over time, they've strategically basically baited and switched them. So oftentimes these victims are confused. They're like, okay, well, 1 week he was my boyfriend. Now he's my pimp. Like, I don't really understand what's happening here. So there's this element of confusion that happens with this. So this person said, I stayed because my pimp offered something my family did not. I grew up in an abusive household where addiction and violence were consistent. My life being trafficked was similar. The difference is my pimp complimented me. They made her feel wanted, like she belonged. Said that he was proud of her. Told her that she was doing a good thing to support the family. So there was a lot of dysfunction in her family, and this family, this connection, allowed her to have that support. And that's what they provided because they were, trafficking her in exchange and getting her money. So he said how important she was, and that she was doing a good thing. And she wanted the attention. She wanted the recognition. He gave it to her, but it was manipulative and it was in a destructive way. But in the same breath, he also rewarded her with things. And then this is Elizabeth Smart, a statement, people would ask her, why didn't you run? Why didn't you say something? Why didn't you speak up sooner? And she said, it's not because anyone enjoys being hurt. It's not because any one of us likes being raped or kidnapped. It's because we do everything we can to survive. You're in survival mode. And there's reasons why we make these decisions. And when people say, why didn't you, they're pointing the finger at you as the victim and saying that you should have been more on top of what was happening and you were responsible. So that doesn't even, that's that blaming, that's that cycle there that doesn't even allow them to heal from the trauma that they've endured. It's like now I'm trying to reintegrate back in society, and society is telling me it's my fault. And, I stayed in it so long that it was my issue. So it's just like many of those things oftentimes keep people stuck. So other reasons why people stay: community silence. Oftentimes people not really knowing about the issue. Oftentimes the individuals are moved from place to place, and maybe they rarely come in contact with institutional systems like the police officers. Oftentimes they're even trained by the trafficker to lie to the police. The trafficker saying, hey, the police aren't going to believe you. And when you saw my slide earlier, sometimes police are involved. Sometimes the doctors are involved. Sometimes the judges are involved. Sometimes the lawyers are involved. So why would they even go to many of these places if they feel like they can't trust these individuals anyway? Other challenges to providing aftercare, I heard a lot of people talk about they're in biology, psychology, education, all these different things, political science, history. when, especially in the healthcare space, when you're trying to provide aftercare, there's that huge element of shame. There's the growth, the addiction, the confusion. Maybe there's no incentive for them to leave. When we talk about the housing problem, I just saw our mayor, Malik Evans, just put a task force in place for housing. He says, we have some serious housing issues. In the middle of a pandemic, people were being evicted. They were losing their jobs. They were being evicted. They had nowhere to go. And you have traffickers, casing these shelters, saying, hey, you need a place to stay? The shelter's full tonight. Come with me. So they are actually creating and adding to this vulnerability and creating this issue. So that, like I said, what is the incentive to leave? You know what you're going to get when you're with your trafficker. When you get out of the life and you're applying for these services, oftentimes when the funding runs out, your resources run out. So that's a big reason why it's problematic to provide aftercare. Some people say, well, we rescued them. Well, how did you really rescue me? I'm now no longer being forced to sleep with 50 men a night, but now I'm in a minimum wage job paying me $9 an hour. I can't pay my rent. I can't pay daycare. I don't have a car, so how are you really rescuing me? So it's many of these different factors. And of course, the judgment from providers or just people that know your story. And then, of course, there's lack of empowerment, maybe limited support systems and mentorship and inconsistent resources. And then, so essentially, how can you help? Really being authentic. Really, how can we stop being complicit? When we think about human trafficking, it's not just about sex trafficking or labor trafficking. Where are our clothes made? The foods that we eat. Many of these things, we don't know our supply chain. And I think people started hearing more about supply chain in the middle of the pandemic when all their things started coming late, to think about, okay, well, where is this really coming from now? Not a lot of people paid attention to that before. Not be judgmental, watch your relationship dynamics. One of the things that we tell nurses, oftentimes, like, for example, if we have a patient come in that, is on drugs, often someone will say, well, we need a urine sample. And they're of saying, I need pain medicine. And the nurse is saying, well, you'll get your pain medicine if you give us a urine sample. Well, guess what? That's still coercion. And how are you any different from their trafficker if you're using the same essential tactics? So we have to be mindful of those dynamics. And then when we talk about self-care, this work can be very traumatic in terms of just listening to these stories, in terms of feeling helpless in yourself, that we don't have the adequate resources for these individuals. So just really trying to create a safe space. If you ever come in contact with an individual in your respective areas, it's not necessarily about them telling you I'm being trafficked. It's really about creating that space so they're able to develop some form of relationship with you until they feel safe enough or supportive enough to talk about the situation or be connected to services. So, being kind, compassionate, like I said, giving resources if you have them, but being more encouraging and empowering. And then the services that they definitely need legal services, because oftentimes what was happening is, you have these, individuals that are out here being trafficked and now they're getting arrested for prostitution. So now you have these records, these charges on your records. And we have a beautiful human trafficking intervention court here, where they essentially work with victims to try to get much of that stuff expunged. They try to connect them with the resources that they need. So if they need some drug resources and counseling, they try to vet them through that court so they can try to get them the resources that they need. Of course, they need a lot of emotional support, cultural awareness. We talk about expunging records for minors. But they need housing, they need food, they still are going to need those basic needs. And then essentially they need individualized care because one size does not fit all trafficking victims. And with that, I'll stop there. I have some resources here, but I can send the PowerPoint along.
Thank you very much, Dr. McIntosh. That was an incredibly powerful and sobering presentation, that's for sure. I'd love to open it up for questions. People are welcome to put questions in the chat. People are welcome to unmute your microphone and ask questions. While we wait for some of the students to formulate questions, one of the things that came to my mind, Dr. McIntosh, you were talking about prostitution arrests, and I wonder if we as a society should be treating prostitutes as human trafficking victims, giving them more social services as opposed to treating them like criminals.
Right. And so this is the thing, there has been a lot of talk about that, and that tends to happen also a lot with transgender individuals because they oftentimes don't have a means of income. So there was legislation introduced a while back, I think a couple years ago. We just actually had another discussion about this at our conference because there was legislation introduced to decriminalize prostitution. But the problem is, here it is again, you're still opening up for the buyer, they still get away with it. The trafficker still gets away with it because so now you decrim prostitution, there's demand, there's open demand, there's no consequences on the demand side. So that's why there are some organizations, rallying around decriminalizing prostitution because we know that it does target a lot of the more vulnerable individuals. They're not getting the resources they're supposed to get because, like I said, there's inequity in the resources. And then, like they are being targeted. So, like I said, I'm not going to say that every single person is human trafficked. Not every single person, but I think that we need to have a very open mind and look through a lens of, could this be something else? Mm-hmm. Let's not just say, oh, they're probably just selling their body, it's their fault. Well, how did they get there? Mm-hmm. Because oftentimes, we hear stories of like this one survivor. She said, I've been trafficked for 7 years. So when they started, they could have been underage, and now it's like, really, now that the laws are catching up, then they really, all those, those charges really need to come off, especially if they were underage when it happened. So, I just think that there needs to be more tolerance, for individuals, and there needs to be more compassion. And definitely they need to improve the resources, but definitely they need to look through a lens of, okay, could this be something else?
Yeah. And I think that relates to a question that Erica had, and I don't know if you want to say anything more about this, Dr. McIntosh, but Erica was asking, why are non-consensual sex workers and victims arrested when they're being trafficked? So I think you were talking about.
Well, this is the thing, because oftentimes, unless you have you're having a conversation with them, you don't necessarily know in that moment. So, if a police walks up, they're just going to see someone out here selling sex. They're not going to know the backstory. And like I said, I think the issue too is that a lot of, a few survivors will say, I didn't have a clue what human trafficking was. Mm-hmm. I didn't know that was a thing. I didn't even know I was a victim. So they don't even know that there's levels to this. You know what I mean? So so the police aren't going to know that, how are they going to differentiate? Oh, you're being trafficked versus you. They can't tell. You know what I'm saying? They cannot tell. It's like, for example, you can't tell who has HIV. People are walking around. You don't know. You know what I mean? So you can't necessarily say, oh, this one's being trafficked versus this one. You don't know until you have the backstory. Mm-hmm. So while I don't agree with it, the reality of it is until they're able to sort the story out a little bit more, they're not going to know that right up front. And I think that's why the individuals that were being impacted by this said, we have to take a stand and we have to do something about this, because this is impacting us, because the more charges we get about prostitution, the less our opportunities are to even get a job. So you're just making it worse, so I hope that answers your question.
I think so. And I think it also relates to Zoe's question here, kind of about talking about education of police officers. So how much are police officers actually educated about these trafficking issues and how to recognize them?
So I would say definitely not often. I mean, there's so many different things that are on their list of kind of like in services or competencies or training things. So they don't get a lot of this education. And because we recognize it as a group, we started collaborating with organizations. Like we've talked to Mike Mazzio and said, we need to try to meet with you and get with your group and, talk more about human trafficking. We've met, prior to all this going on with Laron Singletary, we met with their group and said, we need to talk to you guys. We need to get in here. We need to educate you. The only one that we actually were able to get into was the Irondequoit Police Department. And we were able to go to their roll calls and give them bullet point information about, risk factors, what you would see, what you would do, who are the resources. But one of our initiatives for this year is to do a LEAP project where we talk about it's a law enforcement awareness project. That's what we're coining it as. We want to get into many of these, police officers, precincts and start talking about having this conversation. So, and the conversation can't stop there. There's so many different, everybody has to have a knowledge base about human trafficking, spas, cosmetology, med spas and nail technicians. All these individuals have to have this awareness because it's happening in our community. Massage therapists, they need to know this information. But, when you have limited manpower, right, it's hard to do, because when you talk about resources, we exist because we wanted to have more coordinated care or coordinated responses for these individuals. And often that's not a 9-to-5 job. So,
and it gets back at the inequities in our society too. So if we don't have the resources, we can't provide those types of training opportunities.
Right. And then you re-victimize these individuals. You know what I mean? And this is the thing with police officers. It's like, okay, if you train them and you don't have, and the funding for an organization that you gave them as a resource ran out, then they don't have anywhere to they don't have a connection. They don't have anything to connect these individuals to. So it just gets very complicated.
Yeah. Heather had a question about somebody escaping trafficking, and they were asking about how does the individual escape without receiving repercussions from their pimp?
Well, I think for this specific person, it was a matter of her saying, I'm done. It was a matter of her saying, I'm done and I'm walking away from this. I'm not going back. She said she was tired of being arrested. She was tired of being drugged up. She was just tired of everything. And like I said, you're not necessarily shackled, So for her, I don't know all the specifics of how she got out, but she just basically said she is at a place where she hit rock bottom. And she was just done. And she had kids and she had lost her kids. And she just wanted a different life. And she says, I struggle every day to recover. So for her, she hasn't really escaped anything, because every single day while she's not in the life, she still thinks her mind is still in the life. Her body may not physically be there, but every day she thinks about getting high. Every day she thinks about the money and the opportunity that she had when she's working these getting $15 an hour. You know what I mean? So has she really escaped? And then many years after she got out of life, still struggling to get all these different charges off her record and sealed. So how has she really escaped? She hasn't. She's gotten physically out of the life, but her mind is still there, because every single day she has to deal with her past every single day, so like I said, for this person specifically, it was a matter of just saying, I'm done. I've had enough. I can't live this way anymore. I've heard stories about some individuals being brought over from Africa and having to work as essentially like a servant and
Indentured
getting
servant.
away. Yeah. And getting away. But I don't know the specifics of that. The case that I am aware of here and that happened at the New York State Fair.
Mm.
What ended up happening was Workers' Justice Center for New York. They had went up to, I think, somewhere in Syracuse and educated a hospital. Okay. And they told them about signs of trafficking. About a couple weeks later, or maybe a month later, they had the New York State Fair. They had, I don't remember the company that they were working for, but I think it was a Greek ice cream company. I don't remember the specific details. This is actually on the website or just on Google. You can Google New York State Fair, human trafficking or something like that, and you should be able to find it. And what ended up happening, these individuals, they ended up getting so sick that they had to go into the hospital.
Oh.
And they ended up, and because, they had been trained, they started saying, okay, something here doesn't make sense. Something here isn't right. And they actually ended up contacting Workers' Justice again. There was a whole big lawsuit, and there was some resolution, but not much. But that is how they ended up. They were so sick. They, were making food. Some of them had bed bugs. Some of them had, other medical issues. They were just very dehydrated. There was no other option. They had to go to the hospital. And it was those workers that had been trained that said, okay, this doesn't make any sense. What is going on? And that's how they were kind of essentially found out about.
Thank you very much, Dr. McIntosh. I was finding a link to that article that you were talking about. If students here want to get involved with your organization, what is the best way to get in contact with you?
So it's RRCAHT, rcat.org. And there's a lot of information. So there's a lot of information on that website about things that we do in terms of training, webinars, conferences. But they can go to that link, which we typically right now have been meeting online for quite some time via Zoom. Our meetings are typically the second Thursday of every month between the hours of 4 to 5:30. We talk about a variety of different things. We talk about our initiatives. So if they ever want to get involved, those are some of the ways. Now, normally, some of the things that we do, we go into the community, we educate them, but we also do awareness events, give them literature about human trafficking. That has been limited because of the whole pandemic and other organizations not having these table events. The one other thing that we do is organizations donate supplies to us in terms of care packages like hygiene products, toothbrushes, toothpastes, etc. And we deliver them to those organizations that are providing direct services to human trafficking survivors. And we have started a human trafficking survivor fund because we know that oftentimes when individuals leave the life, they have to go through so much red tape to get a little bit of funding. So we're trying to bridge that gap by having those funds. So.
Thank you very much for helping to educate us, Dr. McIntosh, and for the incredibly important and good work that you're doing. Any other questions from the students or anybody else that's in our Zoom room? I wish you all the best. And again, Dr. McIntosh, thank you very much for this presentation. It's very helpful.
You're welcome. Will you also send me the recording?
Yes, absolutely.
All right, thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
You're welcome.